Imagine reaching into your wallet, pulling out money, and then someone telling you that tomorrow it won't exist anymore. Not because it lost value, not because it was counterfeit, but because the government decided it shouldn't exist. No announcement, no public vote, no dramatic moment in the history books, just gone. What if I told you that something like this actually happened? That entire types of currency, money people used every day to buy food, pay workers, and build towns, were quietly erased from history. Not just in one country, but across multiple countries, within the same few decades. And once you notice it, the story of modern money starts to look very different. Because before the system we know today, before centralized banking, before standardized national currency, money looked completely different. It was local, it was tied to real things, and in many cases, it was created by the communities themselves. But by the late 1800s, most of it had disappeared, not destroyed in war, not rejected by the public, but slowly replaced, piece by piece, until almost nobody remembered it existed. Tonight, we're going to explore the currency that history quietly deleted and why it had vanished. To understand this story, we have to go back to a time when money wasn't controlled by a single national system. In the early 1800s, especially in the United States, money came from hundreds of different places. Individual banks issued their own notes. A bank in Ohio might print currency completely different from a bank in New York. A merchant in Indiana could receive a note printed by a local bank and use it to buy goods down the street. And these notes weren't just random paper. They represented something tangible: land, stored grain, warehouse receipts, agricultural assets. In other words, real wealth that actually existed. A farmer could walk into a bank with proof of stored crops or land ownership, and the bank might issue notes backed by those assets. Those notes would circulate through the community as money. The system wasn't perfect. Some banks failed. Some issued more notes than they could redeem. But the picture painted in many textbooks, that it was total chaos, isn't entirely accurate. In several states, especially places like Louisiana and New York, the system was surprisingly stable. Banks had strict rules. Many required strong asset backing. And because they were local institutions, people often knew exactly who ran them. If something went wrong, you didn't have to call a distant office in another city. You could walk right into the bank and demand answers. That kind of accountability created a very different relationship between people and their money. Money wasn't something distant or abstract. It was connected to the local economy, to farms, to warehouses, to production, to real things people could see. But that system wouldn't last, because starting in the 1860s, something began to change. In 1863, during the American Civil War, the government passed a piece of legislation called the National Banking Act. On the surface, it sounded like a technical reform, a way to standardize currency and strengthen the financial system. But the details mattered. Under the new system, banks could issue nationally recognized banknotes. However, there was one condition: those notes had to be backed by U.S. government bonds, not farmland, not stored crops, not industrial goods, government debt. Banks had to purchase federal bonds and deposit them with the government before they could print national currency. That meant something subtle but important had changed. Money was no longer tied primarily to local assets. Instead, it was tied to government obligations. But even that wasn't the biggest shift. The real turning point came a few years later, because instead of outright banning the older local currencies, the government did something quieter. They taxed them. In 1865, a 10% tax was placed on state banknotes. Now think about that for a moment. 10% every year. For a bank issuing currency, that kind of tax makes the system almost impossible to maintain. banks quickly stopped printing their own notes, not because they were illegal, but because it was no longer economically viable. Within a few years, most local currencies disappeared, and with them, the decentralized monetary system that had existed for decades. But the story doesn't end there, because another major change happened just a few years later, and this one involved something that had been used as money for thousands of years: silver. For most of American history, both gold and silver were considered legal forms of money. This system was called bimetallism. Silver was especially important for ordinary people. It was more abundant than gold, more accessible, and easier for smaller transactions. Farmers, miners, and working communities relied heavily on silver coins. But in 1873, Congress passed another piece of legislation called the Coinage Act. Buried inside the technical details of that law was a major change. The standard silver dollar was quietly removed from the list of official coins to be minted. Silver had effectively been demonetized. At the time, very few people noticed. The bill was dense, complicated, and many lawmakers later admitted they didn't fully understand what it contained. But when the effects became clear, critics began calling it something else: the crime of 1873. Because removing silver from the monetary system had major consequences. Gold became the dominant monetary metal, and gold was far more concentrated. Large institutions held most of it. Silver, by contrast, had been widely available, especially in mining regions across the American West. By eliminating silver and local banknotes within roughly the same decade, the monetary system became far more centralized. But what makes this story even stranger is that something very similar happened in other countries too. Around the same time period, several major economies began restructuring their financial systems. In 1844, Britain passed the Bank Charter Act, which gave the Bank of England control of most currency issuance. Germany created the Reichsbank in the 1870s, consolidating monetary authority after unification. Japan modeled parts of its banking system after American legislation in the early 1870s. Canada centralized note issuance during the same era. Country after country moved toward the same structure: centralized banking institutions, standardized national currency, and systems tied to government debt or gold reserves, all within roughly a few decades. Now, historians usually explain this as modernization. Industrial economies needed stable financial systems. Trade was expanding. Governments wanted uniform currency. Those explanations are partly true, but the speed and similarity of these changes across different nations is still remarkable. Because once these reforms happened, the older forms of money almost vanished. Local banknotes were withdrawn. Silver coins lost importance. Community-based currency systems faded away, and most of the physical evidence disappeared with them. Today, surviving examples of those old banknotes are incredibly rare. Collectors sometimes find them in archives or private collections, and when you look at them, something interesting stands out. They weren't generic. Each note often reflected the place it came from. You might see a drawing of a local canal, a farmer plowing a field, a city landmark. Sometimes the notes even included multiple languages used in that community. They were almost like miniature historical documents, money that told you something about the people who used it. But when those currencies were phased out, most of them were destroyed. Once a note was canceled, it had no value, so it was burned, shredded, discarded, which means a huge portion of that monetary history simply vanished. Entire systems of local finance reduced to fragments of paper and museum drawers. But the biggest change wasn't the disappearance of the notes themselves. It was the shift in how money entered the economy. Under many older systems, money could emerge directly from productive assets. A farmer storing grain could receive notes representing that stored value. Money expanded as production expanded.
But under the newer centralized system, money typically entered circulation through credit. Banks issued loans, governments issued bonds, and currency was tied to those instruments. That doesn't necessarily make the system worse. Modern banking has enabled enormous economic growth, global trade, infrastructure, technological development. But it also changed the relationship between people and their money, because now accessing money often means accessing credit, and accessing credit means dealing with institutions that decide who qualifies. That structure still shapes the financial world today. And that brings us back to the question at the center of this story. If those older currencies disappeared so quietly, why don't we talk about them more? Why aren't they part of the standard story of economic history? After all, the transition from local money to centralized systems was one of the biggest